What if everything you believed about yourself, who you are, where you come from, was nothing but a carefully constructed lie? What if the people who raised you, who held you as a baby, who watched you grow, had been keeping a secret so devastating, so unimaginable, that the truth itself was enough to push someone past the edge of reason? A young man, quiet, reserved, never the one to stand out, had always felt something was off. Small things. Moments that didn't add up. A feeling, buried deep, that he didn't belong. But life went on. Questions left unasked. Assumptions left unchallenged. Until one day, out of nothing more than curiosity, he took a simple DNA test. Just for fun. Just to see. And then, in the space of a single moment, a single result, his entire world came crashing down. Because the man he had called his father was not his father. And the person he had known as his older brother. The one who had taught him how to ride a bike, who had given him advice about girls, who had always looked out for him. He wasn't his brother. He was something else entirely. Reality bent. The ground beneath him cracked open. The life he had known, every memory, every birthday, every family dinner, became something unrecognizable. A lie so vast, so carefully hidden, that it had taken him nearly 3 decades to uncover. And when he did, he didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He waited. He planned. And then, one night, when the air was heavy and the house was quiet, when his parents were exactly where they always were, tucked away, safe in the comfort of the home they had built on deception, he made his choice. What happened next would leave a town in shock. A family in ruins. And a courtroom full of people asking themselves the same question: was this an act of unspeakable evil, or an inevitable consequence of a lifetime of lies? Stay with us as we unravel the disturbing true crime story of a man who uncovered the truth about his past. And made sure the ones who hid it would never tell another lie again. Like and subscribe for more true crime stories. Daniel Carter was never the kind of person who drew too much attention. At 27, he lived a quiet, uneventful life in Spokane, Washington. He had no criminal record, no history of violence. Just an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. He was intelligent, always had been, but not the type to show off. He kept to himself, spoke when spoken to, never caused trouble. People who knew him would describe him as polite, maybe a little distant, but nothing out of the ordinary. He had a steady job at a local warehouse, the kind of work that didn't require much conversation. He wasn't the type to have many friends, but that never seemed to bother him. His world was small: home, work, routine. He had always been close to his family, though there had been moments, brief ones, where he felt like an outsider. He had brushed them off, like people do. Everyone feels that way sometimes, don't they? Richard and Margaret Carter had been good parents. Strict but loving. The kind of couple who believed in discipline, in order, in keeping things in their rightful place. They had raised Daniel with firm hands but warm hearts. And Michael had always been the golden child. At 42, he was everything Daniel wasn't. Successful. Confident. The kind of man people listened to when he spoke. The kind of man people admired. There had always been a distance between them, something unspoken, but they were family. That was all that mattered. But then, one day, for no reason other than curiosity, Daniel decided to take a DNA test. Maybe he had seen an ad online. Maybe a coworker had mentioned it. He didn't remember. It didn't seem like a big deal. Just a quick swab, a couple of clicks, and a few weeks of waiting. He had no real expectations. Maybe he'd learn something interesting about his ancestry. Maybe he'd find a distant cousin somewhere across the country. What he found instead was something else entirely. The results arrived in his email, just another notification among the hundreds of others. He opened it without thinking, barely paying attention, until his eyes locked on something that didn't make sense. He read it once, then again. His hands went still. His breath caught in his chest. Because according to the results, the people he had always called his parents were not his parents. His father wasn't his father. And Michael wasn't just his brother. He was his father. The test confirmed it. There was no mistake. The numbers were right there in front of him. His world, the only one he had ever known, suddenly felt like a house of cards collapsing in slow motion. He tried to process it, to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be found. Everything, every memory, every conversation, every moment of his life had been built on a lie so enormous he couldn't breathe beneath it. And then, after the shock settled, after the confusion gave way to something else, something colder, something heavier, Daniel made a decision. He was going to get answers. And nothing, was ever going to be the same again. Daniel Carter had always struggled with a quiet, lingering feeling of not quite fitting in. It wasn't anything he could ever put into words, just something he felt, something that sat in the back of his mind like a shadow. He wasn't rebellious, wasn't difficult. He did what was expected of him, kept his head down, followed the rules. But growing up, there were moments when he felt different, like an extra piece in a puzzle where everything else fit together except him. His parents never gave him a reason to think otherwise. Richard and Margaret Carter were good parents, or at least, that's what everyone believed. Richard had been a high school teacher for over 3 decades, well respected in the community. He had a firm way of speaking, a presence that demanded attention, but there was warmth in him too. He believed in hard work, in discipline, in doing things the right way. Margaret was the kind of woman who knew everyone's birthday, who never missed a church service, who always made sure her home looked perfect, as if nothing bad could ever happen inside those walls. Together, they were seen as the ideal couple, strict, yes, but loving. They had raised Daniel the best way they knew how. Or so it seemed. And then there was Michael. Michael Carter had always been different from Daniel. Confident, charismatic, successful. The golden child. The one everyone admired. He had left home early, built a name for himself, climbed the corporate ladder until he was the kind of man people looked up to. When he spoke, people listened. When he entered a room, he belonged there. Unlike Daniel, who always felt like he was standing just outside the circle. The brothers, if that's what they were, had never been close. There was a distance between them, one that Daniel could never quite explain. Growing up, Michael had always been around, but never in the way an older brother should be. And now, Daniel understood why. Michael had never been his brother. He had been something else entirely. The DNA test had pulled back a curtain Daniel didn't even know existed, revealing a truth so twisted he could barely think straight. Richard and Margaret weren't his parents. His so-called father was actually his grandfather. His mother, who had raised him, fed him, kissed him goodnight, was his grandmother. And Michael, the perfect son, the one who had everything, was the one who had brought him into this world. But if Michael was his father, then who was his mother? That was the question that rattled inside Daniel's skull, the question that made his hands shake when he looked at the results. There was no answer, no name. Just an empty space where the truth should have been. And that was the moment something inside Daniel shifted. The truth wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed answers. He needed the people who had lied to him his entire life to look him in the eye and tell him why. But before any of that could happen, before anyone could explain, before anyone could try to undo the damage that had already been done, the house on Whitmore Lane would become a crime scene. 2 people would be dead. And the truth Daniel had uncovered would be buried beneath something far worse. When the police arrived, when the sirens cut through the quiet neighborhood, when Detective Emily Lawson stepped onto the scene, she didn't know what to expect. She had worked homicide cases before, had seen terrible things, but there was something about this crime that felt different. Personal. Messy. Something that didn't fit into a simple box. It wasn't just a murder. It was the result of years of deception, of secrets so deep they had finally clawed their way to the surface. She would be the one to piece together the story, to go through the evidence, to listen to the interviews, to try to understand why a young man, quiet, intelligent, seemingly harmless, would snap in such a brutal, irreversible way. And then there was Dr. Henry Collins, the forensic specialist who would later confirm everything, the DNA test, the impossible connections, the truth that had driven Daniel Carter to the edge. He had seen strange things in his career, but nothing quite like this. Nothing that twisted biology and family and betrayal into something this horrifying. By the time the dust settled, by the time the last body was taken away, one question remained. Was this a crime of passion? Or was it something worse? Something planned, something inevitable. Because when a man's entire life is built on a lie, when the people he trusts most have been lying to him from the very beginning, how does he react when the truth finally comes out? For Daniel Carter, the answer had already been written in blood. A week passed. A week of silence, of sleepless nights, of Daniel staring at the DNA results until the letters and numbers blurred together. He had thought about confronting them the moment he saw the test, but something held him back. Maybe it was disbelief. Maybe he hoped there was some mistake. Maybe he wasn't ready to hear the truth. But with every passing day, the anger grew, tightening around him like a noose. He couldn't eat. Couldn't focus. Couldn't think about anything else. On the seventh night, he decided. He waited until the house was dark, until the familiar creaks of the floorboards told him his parents had gone to bed. The paper was still clutched in his fist when he knocked on their door, his hands cold, his breath shallow. A moment later, light spilled into the hallway as Margaret opened it, her face lined with confusion. "Daniel? What is it?" He didn't answer. He pushed past her into the room, turned to face both of them, Richard, still half asleep, sitting up in bed, and Margaret, wrapping her robe tighter around her. "I need you to tell me the truth," Daniel said, his voice steady, too steady. His father frowned. "What are you talking about?" "This." Daniel threw the crumpled test onto the bed. "I took a DNA test." A pause. A silence that stretched too long. His mother's hand went to her throat. His father's expression changed, something flickered in his eyes, something that made Daniel's stomach turn. "Tell me," Daniel said. "Tell me why it says Michael isn't my brother." Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came out. Richard exhaled, rubbing his temples. "We were going to tell you one day," he muttered. "When?" Daniel's voice rose. "When were you going to tell me that my brother is actually my father?" Margaret started crying. "We didn't have a choice." "No choice." Daniel laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You lied to me for 27 years. We did what we had to do," Richard said, his voice growing sharper. "Michael was too young. He was just a kid. If people found out, so you just decided to raise me as your son? Pretend I was yours?" His father's jaw tightened. "We gave you a good life, Daniel." Daniel's breath came faster, his fingers curling into fists. He felt like he was suffocating, like the walls of the bedroom were pressing in on him. "You lied to me," he whispered. "We protected you." Daniel shook his head. Protected. That word. That word was poison. They hadn't protected him. They had controlled him. Manipulated him. Built his entire life on a lie and expected him to accept it. His mother stepped forward, reaching for his arm. "Daniel, please. We love you." Something inside him snapped. Love. That word, too. In one quick motion, his hand shot out, shoving Margaret backward. She stumbled, her back hitting the dresser. Richard lunged forward, grabbing Daniel's wrist, but Daniel was faster. He didn't know when he had reached for the knife. He had taken it from the kitchen earlier, held onto it like a lifeline. Now, it was in his hand, and before Richard could react, Daniel drove the blade into his chest. The sound Richard made wasn't a scream. More like a gasp, a choked noise of shock as he stumbled back onto the bed, his hands pressing to the wound. Margaret's scream filled the room. Daniel turned to her, breathing hard, the knife dripping onto the floor. She ran for the door, but she was slow, too slow. He caught her by the arm and pulled her back, the force of it making her stumble into him. He didn't hesitate. The blade sank into her abdomen, again and again, her cries growing weaker until she collapsed onto the carpet, motionless. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound except his own breath, ragged, unsteady. He looked down. The blood had already spread, soaking into the fabric of the bed, the floor. His father's body twitched once. His mother's fingers were still curled, as if she had been reaching for something, maybe for him. Daniel stood there, his pulse slowing, his hands sticky with blood. Then, he walked to the nightstand, picked up the landline phone, and dialed 911. The operator answered. 911, what's your emergency? Daniel's voice was eerily calm. I just killed my parents. A pause. Sir, can you repeat that? Because they lied. The house was quiet when officers arrived. Too quiet. No shouting, no crying, no sounds of struggle, just the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. The front door was unlocked. No signs of forced entry. No hurried escape. Just a man sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly in his lap, his shirt soaked through with blood. Daniel Carter didn't flinch when the officers stepped inside, guns drawn. He didn't raise his hands in surrender, didn't protest, didn't ask for a lawyer. He just sat there, staring straight ahead at the blank wall. One of the officers, Sergeant Tom Grayson, moved cautiously toward him, scanning the room. The blood wasn't just on his clothes. It streaked his hands, dried under his fingernails, dotted the linoleum floor beneath him. A single kitchen knife lay on the table, its blade dark, the handle smeared with fingerprints. Daniel Carter. Grayson's voice was firm, measured. Daniel turned his head slowly, as if the name was foreign to him. Then, after a moment, he nodded. Grayson gestured to the floor. Get on your knees. Hands behind your head. Daniel obeyed without a word. No struggle, no hesitation. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, the cool metal biting into his skin, but he didn't react. Where are your parents? Another officer asked. Daniel's voice was quiet, almost detached. Upstairs. When the officers found Richard and Margaret Carter, the bedroom told them everything they needed to know. The blood on the sheets. The deep wounds, some defensive, some not. The overturned lamp on the nightstand. Margaret's hand frozen mid-reach. Richard's body slumped against the pillows, eyes still open, staring at nothing. The scene was violent. Messy. A crime of passion. And yet the killer sat in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. Back at the precinct, Daniel didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for a phone call. He didn't ask for anything. I just want to sleep, he mumbled once, rubbing his temple as if it ached. Detective Emily Lawson was assigned to the case within the hour. She had been with the department for over 15 years, seen her fair share of homicides, family disputes that turned deadly. But this? This was different. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a drunken fight that escalated. This was a son who had killed the people who raised him. And for what? A lie. When she entered the interrogation room, Daniel barely looked up. His fingers tapped absently against the cold steel table, his expression unreadable. I'm Detective Lawson, she said, taking a seat across from him. Do you understand why you're here? Daniel nodded. Do you want to tell me what happened tonight? He was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he exhaled. "They lied to me," he said. "That's why you killed them?" Another pause. Then, "Yes." Lawson studied him, noting the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he spoke as if each word was being dragged out of him. This wasn't a man who had planned a murder. This wasn't a man who had covered his tracks, tried to escape, or even attempted to defend himself. This was a man who had snapped. As the interviews continued, the story began to unfold. The DNA test. The confrontation. The confession. A team was sent to Daniel's apartment to search for anything that might explain his state of mind: journals, messages, online searches. They found the DNA report crumpled in a trash bin, the email confirmation from the testing company still sitting in his inbox. Meanwhile, the news spread fast. The Carters were well known in their community, their deaths sending shockwaves through Spokane. Neighbors described them as decent people. Friends called them dedicated parents. Margaret was kind, one woman said, shaking her head in disbelief. "She used to bring food to my house when my husband was sick. I don't understand how this could happen." Others weren't as sympathetic. "Something about that family always seemed off," one man admitted. "Michael was always the favorite. You could see it. And Daniel. I don't know. He never really fit in." Michael Carter, upon hearing the news, was devastated. He arrived at the police station hours later, his face pale, his hands shaking as he spoke to detectives. "I didn't know," he kept repeating. "I swear, I didn't know." But was that true? Lawson wasn't sure. Forensics confirmed what was already obvious: the DNA test hadn't lied. Michael was Daniel's biological father. Which meant Richard and Margaret had spent decades keeping a secret so deep, so carefully buried, that even the man at the center of it had no idea. Or did he? Interviews with family members painted a complicated picture. Some claimed Michael had always been treated differently, with more freedom, more praise, more responsibility. Others hinted that Richard and Margaret had been overprotective of Daniel in a way that went beyond normal parenting. Margaret never let him do anything alone, an old family friend recalled. Not even when he was a teenager. She acted like, I don't know. Like she owed him something. The media wasted no time picking the story apart. Headlines flooded the news. A family's darkest secret ends in blood. DNA test sparks murder, the Carter family tragedy. Brother or father? A shocking truth that led to death. Public opinion was divided. Some saw Daniel as a cold-blooded killer. Others saw him as a victim. And as Detective Lawson combed through the details, one question remained. Had the truth really set Daniel free? Or had it destroyed him? The trial of Daniel Carter gripped the nation. A crime born not from greed or revenge, but from something far more personal, an unraveling of identity so profound that it shattered everything in its path. Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. On one side sat the prosecution, prepared to paint Daniel as a calculated killer, a man who had not only murdered but had done so with violent precision. On the other, the defense, arguing that what had happened that night was not premeditation, but a complete psychological break, a man driven to the edge by a truth too heavy to bear. Day after day, witness after witness took the stand, each one adding a new layer to the twisted story of the Carter family. Michael Carter sat quietly, avoiding Daniel's gaze, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as if he were holding himself together. He had lost his parents, discovered he was a father, and learned his own son was a murderer, all in the span of a week. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the facts. The crime scene was brutal, they said. The wounds on Richard and Margaret Carter were deep, the sheer number of stab wounds showing intent. This wasn't a single moment of rage, a brief loss of control, this was sustained violence. Prolonged. Deliberate. This was murder, the prosecutor declared, pacing in front of the jury. This was anger turned into action. He knew what he was doing. He made the choice. And now, he must face the consequences. They called on forensic experts to drive the point home. Dr. Henry Collins, the forensic specialist who had analyzed the scene, described each wound in detail, his voice clinical, detached. The jury flinched as he explained how some of the injuries suggested Margaret had tried to fight back. The evidence tells a clear story, he concluded. This was not an accident. This was not a crime of hesitation. But the defense was ready. Daniel's attorney countered with a different version of events. They called psychologists, former teachers, even childhood friends to the stand. Daniel had never been violent before. He had no history of aggression. No arrests. No behavioral issues. If anything, he had spent most of his life as the quiet one, the withdrawn one. He was a boy who always seemed like he was searching for something, his high school teacher said. Like he didn't quite know where he fit. Then came the expert witnesses, mental health professionals who had studied Daniel's case in depth. One by one, they spoke about identity fractures, the effects of prolonged deception, the psychological shock of discovering that everything you believed about yourself was a lie. This is a textbook case of dissociation, one psychiatrist explained. Daniel's entire world crumbled in a single moment. He wasn't just angry, he was unmoored. Lost. His reaction, though tragic, was the result of a psychological collapse. They called it temporary insanity. They called it an emotional blackout. They argued that in that moment, Daniel was not in control of himself. The jury listened. The nation listened. And when the time came to decide his fate, the weight of it was undeniable. Deliberations stretched for weeks. Whispers filled the courthouse. Was Daniel a cold-blooded murderer? Or was he simply a man pushed beyond his limits? When the verdict was finally read, the room was silent. Guilty. Second-degree murder. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. The sentence sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Some gasped. Some nodded. Some wept. Michael Carter closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, as if he had been holding his breath for weeks. Daniel sat still, expression unreadable, as if the words barely registered. Even as the gavel slammed down, even as officers moved to take him away, he showed no reaction. No protest. No tears. The trial was over. The sentence was final. But the question remained. Was justice truly served? Or had Daniel Carter simply traded one prison for another? What makes a person who they are? Is it their upbringing, their memories, the people they call family? Or is it something deeper, something embedded in their very DNA? And what happens when everything they believed about themselves turns out to be a lie? Daniel Carter lived his entire life believing one truth. That his parents, Richard and Margaret Carter, were his biological mother and father. That his older brother, Michael, was just that, an older sibling who had gone ahead in life, built his own success, and remained a strong but distant figure. But in one moment, with the results of a simple DNA test, that truth crumbled. His parents had lied. His brother was actually his father. The people who raised him had carried this secret for nearly 3 decades, building a reality out of deception, forcing him to live a life based on something that was never real. The weight of that revelation was more than he could bear. The foundation of his existence had been stripped away, replaced with something unrecognizable, something he never consented to. Every moment of his childhood, every conversation, every hug, every word of reassurance from the people he trusted, they all became tainted, rewritten in an instant. His mother was not his mother. His father was not his father. And Michael, the man he had grown up looking to as an older brother, was something entirely different, a father who had been absent without ever truly being absent. The betrayal was too much. The rage consumed him. And in a single, violent outburst, he made a decision that could never be undone. 2 lives taken. 2 secrets exposed. 1 man left to face the consequences. But was Daniel truly in control of his actions? Could anyone, faced with such a brutal revelation, hold on to reason? The human mind is fragile. The heart, even more so. The people he should have trusted most had kept from him the very thing that defined him. They had stolen his right to know who he really was. And in the end, the court decided his fate. A life sentence. No chance of parole. Some saw it as justice. Others saw it as another tragedy. A young man whose life had already been shaped by lies, now condemned to spend the rest of it behind bars. But the questions remain. How far can a lie go before it destroys everything? Can the truth ever truly set someone free if it comes too late? And if you woke up tomorrow to find out that your entire life had been built on deception, who would you become? Let us know what you think in the comments. Was Daniel a victim, or a murderer with no excuse? And if you enjoyed this true crime story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more cases just like this. Thanks for watching. If this case left you questioning everything you thought you knew about identity, deception, and justice, make sure to subscribe for more true crime stories just like this. Every case holds a truth buried beneath years of secrets, waiting to be uncovered. And in our next episode, a missing girl returns home after years, only there's one problem. She insists she's someone else entirely. A case that leaves family, investigators, and even psychologists wondering, is she telling the truth, or is there something much darker at play? Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the truth is far more terrifying than any lie.